Not every horror story begins with blood. Some begin with silence, the kind that hangs in a chamber just before the knife falls. Long before empires perfected their systems of mutilation, humanity discovered a terrifying truth: the fastest way to control a man was to unmake him. The practice of castration reaches back further than most written history. Archaeologists uncover its traces in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, in the laws of ancient Sumer, even in the whispers of early myths. At first, it was punishment, a cruel way to brand an enemy as broken. But somewhere along the way, rulers realized something darker: a castrated body could become more than a warning. It could become useful. In the temples of the Near East, priests dedicated to goddesses like Cybele and Ishtar performed self-castration in frenzied rituals, offering their flesh as sacrifice. In China, by the Zhou dynasty, castration had hardened into policy. Boys were altered to serve as eunuchs within the imperial court. And in the Mediterranean world, soldiers who fell in battle sometimes woke not to death, but to the knife of an enemy who chose humiliation over killing. Over time, what began as scattered cruelty transformed into a deliberate system, repeated across continents. Different cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, arrived at the same grim solution. When rulers needed loyalty, when conquerors wanted revenge, when priests demanded devotion, they reached for the same set of tools: the blade, the fire, the cord. And so, history filled itself with shadows. What began as ritual or punishment evolved into methods so varied, and so horrifying, that they read today like a catalogue of nightmares. Let's open that catalogue now, and look at 10 terrifying ways castration was done in history. Simple incision. They called it the simplest way, but there was nothing simple about it. A man would be forced down, his legs spread, and in a single motion the blade descended. With no anesthetic, no preparation, just steel against flesh, the testicles were excised. Sometimes the wound was cauterized with a heated iron, sometimes only bound with cloth, leaving infection to decide the victim's fate. This was one of the oldest methods known to humanity, practiced in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the markets of Greece and Rome. It required no special instruments, only a sharp knife and the willingness to ignore the screams. The cost was high: bleeding, fever, and death claimed countless victims. Yet empires repeated the cut again and again, because even in its brutality, it worked. It ended a man's fertility in a matter of seconds. And with every drop of blood spilled, rulers carved fear into the hearts of their people. These are the kinds of stories most textbooks will never tell you: dark, disturbing truths hidden in the folds of our past. If you want to keep exploring history's most chilling corners, then step deeper with us. Subscribe now to Tale of History. Because the past is darker than you think, and we uncover the shadows that shaped our world. They called it the final erasure. Not merely the removal of function, but the removal of identity as the society of the time understood it. In complete emasculation, the blade did not stop at the testicles, it went further, severing both penis and scrotum in a single, deliberate act. Where the simple incision ended, this procedure finished the job. It was surgical in intent and savage in consequence. Imagine the scene without the theatrics: a man stripped and bound, the air heavy with the metallic tang of tools and the dry tinder of cauteries. No anesthesia. The operator, whether a court surgeon, a jailer, or an executioner, set the decision in motion with 1 or 2 swift strokes. The wound was larger, the blood loss more severe. Hemorrhage could not always be controlled by the crude ligatures and heated irons of the age. Where physicians could attempt careful closure and cauterization, many victims simply bled until the body shut down or until infection finished what the knife started. This method appears across the archaeological and literary record in several forms. In some ritual contexts, it functioned as an absolute transformation. The initiate or devotee who sacrificed both penis and testicles was remade into a new social or religious role. In punitive contexts, it was a statement: the offender would not merely be rendered infertile, they would be publicly unmade. In warfare and in the management of slaves, complete emasculation was sometimes used as a tool of humiliation as much as of control. Physically, the stakes of this method were grim. The larger wounds increased the chance of exsanguination in the immediate aftermath. They also made post-procedure infections and urinary complications far more likely. Without modern surgical theaters, many victims died within hours or days from shock, uncontrolled bleeding, or sepsis. Those who survived faced lifelong disabilities, chronic infections, strictures of the urethra, difficulties with urination that required tubes or makeshift solutions, and profound hormonal change that altered body composition, voice, and physiology over time. Technically, this operation demanded either speed or a modicum of surgical skill. A clumsy cut could sever arteries and cause rapid death. A carefully performed removal, if such a thing existed in the particular time and place, would attempt to ligate vessels, cauterize the wound, and fashion an opening to allow urine to pass. In societies with specialized medical knowledge, the procedure might be done by a trained practitioner with instruments intended to reduce immediate mortality. In more brutal circumstances, the act was rushed and punitive, intended to maim rather than to preserve life. The social consequences, while not our focus here, often followed from the physical. Complete emasculation removed a man from his expected bodily role in his community, leaving him dependent, marked, and altered for life. Yet the ache and the practical reality began with the cut and continued with every attempt to heal. If you find these grim slices of the past as compelling as they are chilling, there is more waiting in the shadows. Subscribe now to Tale of History. We peel back the veil on history's darkest practices, and we do it with facts, voice, and a steady light. They wanted the result without the spectacle, to take a man's seed and leave no tidy wound to show for it. Crushing did that work. It turned flesh into rubble, silence into slow, internal death. Crushing was a method built on force rather than finesse. Instead of laying a blade against skin, the executioner or handler used pressure, a blunt strike, a heavy board, a horse's step, or specially made clamps, to obliterate the testicular tissue from the inside. The goal was the same as more surgical methods: remove fertility, remove potency, remove a part of a man's life. But the mechanics, and the aftermath, were very different. Imagine a clamp tightened until the scrotum folded and the soft nodules within were ground down to pulp. Or picture a captive pressed beneath a wooden plank while weight bore down methodically until nerves failed and tissue died. There may be no visible, clean cut to photograph later, no neat bowl to collect remains. Instead, the body reacted from within: swelling, bruising, internal rupture, the slow spread of necrosis as crushed tissue failed and rotted. Sometimes the crushing was immediate and brutal, a deliberate application of blunt force in battle or punishment. Other times it was engineered, devices that squeezed in stages, straps or ropes tightened slowly until the testicles were functionally destroyed. Why choose crushing? In many contexts it was practical. When a culture wanted to disable a man without leaving a gaping surgical wound, either to reduce external signs of punishment, to avoid the infection risks of an open incision, or simply because no skilled surgeon was available, crushing offered an alternative. It required fewer tools, less technical skill, and could be performed by soldiers or jailers rather than trained physicians. For raiders on campaign, where speed and rough efficiency mattered, crushing was efficient. For those aiming to humiliate without creating immediately obvious mutilation, it left the victim altered but outwardly less visually marked. The medical consequences were merciless in their own way. Crushed tissue does not heal as neatly as a cleanly excised organ. The body's response could include massive swelling, internal bleeding, and severe, lingering pain. Without proper treatment, and in historical contexts that treatment was rarely available, crushing often led to infections that developed under the skin. Because much of the damage was internal, it could be harder to clean, drain, or cauterize effectively. Abscesses formed. Fever followed. The slow work of necrosis could sear the body's strength away over days or weeks. Some victims survived the initial violence only to face chronic complications, fistulas, persistent inflammation, hormonal collapse, and lifelong impairment. Culturally, crushing appears in many reports where blunt force was the weapon of choice: battlefield punishments, quick humiliations inflicted by conquering forces, or as a less skillful method carried out by non-medical personnel. It also surfaced in rituals where destroying reproductive capability was required but where cutting was taboo or impractical. Whatever the motive, crushing left a different kind of scar, one that often went unseen by spectators but which haunted the survivor from the inside out. History's cruelties take as many shapes as the hands that commit them. Crushing traded spectacle for efficiency, but its consequences were no less brutal. Subscribe now to Tale of History. We dig into the dark, precise, and often hidden mechanics of the past. If you want more grim realities explained with calm facts and cinematic voice, join us. Some punishments do not end with a blade. Some are designed to linger, to gnaw at the body slowly, turning every hour into agony. The ligature method was not a cut, but a choke. It killed by silence, not through steel, but through the slow suffocation of flesh. This technique relied on one simple principle: cut off the blood, and the body destroys itself. A cord, sometimes silk, sometimes hemp, sometimes even animal sinew, was wound tightly around the scrotum. The knot was pulled again and again until the veins collapsed and circulation stopped. What followed was a kind of living death. The tissue starved, swelled, darkened, and eventually rotted away. Unlike the flash of a blade, this was a waiting game. Victims endured days, sometimes a full week, of worsening pain. At first there was only numbness and throbbing. Soon the flesh grew cold, blackened with gangrene. Infection spread upward through the body, fever spiked, and shivers racked the victim's frame. In some cases, attendants or executioners returned after several days to slice away the dead tissue. In others, the decayed remains simply sloughed off, leaving a mutilated survivor marked by agony. The Ottomans in particular refined this method. For boys destined to serve in harems or courts, partial castration by ligature became a preferred alternative to the knife. Surgeons claimed it was cleaner, fewer open wounds, fewer deaths from hemorrhage. In reality, it was simply slower, shifting the risks from sudden bleeding to prolonged infection. The boys twisted in fever, urine sometimes blocked by swelling, lives hanging in balance while silk cords dug into their flesh. Those who survived did so weakened and scarred. But the Ottomans were not alone. Variants of this method appeared across different cultures when circumstances demanded. On battlefields, ligatures improvised from rope or leather straps turned soldiers into eunuchs without the need for surgical instruments. Among slave traders, it provided a way to sterilize captives before transport, when skilled cutters were not available. In village punishments, it was chosen precisely for its drawn-out cruelty, to make pain last, to make fear spread. The danger of necrosis was that it did not stop at the testicles. If left unchecked, gangrene could climb into the abdomen, poisoning the blood. What began with a rope could end in septic death. Even survivors bore the mark of mutilation in more ways than one. Scar tissue could block normal urination, forcing them to rely on crude tubes. Hormonal collapse reshaped their bodies, softer voices, altered faces, weakened frames. The ligature was not just a noose for the flesh. It was a sentence that reshaped a life. The cruelty of the ligature lay not in its swiftness, but in its patience. It was a punishment designed to take days, to make agony itself into a tool of control. Subscribe now to Tale of History, because the past was not only bloody, it was calculated. We bring you the darkest truths that history tried to hide. When steel alone would not do, someone brought fire. Cauterization turned the surgeon's tool into the torturer's instrument, heated metal pressed into flesh to seal, to scar, or simply to burn the life out of what remained. Cauterization lived on the knife's edge between medicine and cruelty. For centuries, surgeons and butchers alike used heated metal to stop hemorrhage. A glowing iron pressed to an open wound coagulated blood and formed a crude seal. It saved lives in an age when ligatures and sterile theaters did not exist. Yet the same knowledge could be twisted into punishment. In some cases, cauterization followed a swift excision, intended to staunch bleeding and preserve the victim. In others, burning itself became the method, slow, deliberate, designed to destroy tissue until there was nothing left to recover. Picture a brazier in a dim chamber, coals white hot, a rod of iron carried from flame to flesh. The operator did not heat it merely to warm the metal, he aimed to scorch, to cauterize deep tissue, to seal arteries with blistering heat. The sound was terrible, the hiss of steam as blood met an ember, the sharp intake of breath from the man below. Smoke stung the eyes. Flesh sealed and blackened where the iron met skin. In surgical hands, the technique reduced the immediate risk of fatal bleeding. In executioner hands, it extended suffering by turning fresh wounds into charred, unhealing scars. Sometimes burning supplemented a cut made with a blade, a quick excision followed by the iron's pressure to stop the arterial spray. At other times, burning was primary, heated pincers or plates clamped and twisted, scorching until tissue sloughed. In public spectacles, executioners heated tongs until they glowed and applied them in view of the crowd, both to destroy and to demonstrate. The visual theater of flame and smoke made every scar a lesson for onlookers. The medical consequences of cauterization were double-edged. It could save a life by preventing exsanguination, but it could also make infection worse. Charred tissue sometimes acted as a barrier, but often it became a site where pus collected and where the body's attempts at healing turned inward. Burns destroy not only skin but also the blood vessels and nerves beneath, creating wounds that healed slowly and poorly in a pre-modern environment. Victims endured fever, necrosis beyond the burned edges, and the constant risk of septic complications in the days that followed. Cauterization as punishment shows up across many records. Palace surgeons in Byzantine basements used hot irons after rapid emasculations, European executioners displayed glowing pincers in town squares, some slave traders and marshals preferred burning when they wanted horror on display. At times the intent was pragmatic, stop the bleeding so the victim might survive for labor or servitude, and at times it was theatrical, meant to prolong agony for the crowd. Even within a single culture, the same tool could be medicine one moment and cruelty the next. Fire healed and fire destroyed. In the wrong hands, a surgeon's skill became spectacle, a life-saving method turned into an instrument of terror. Subscribe now to Tale of History, where we pull back the curtain on the past's darkest instruments and the hands that used them. Join us, if you dare. If the blade made a clean break, chemicals made a quiet rot. No theatrical flash, no dramatic bowl to lift, only a slow corrosion, a private unmaking that ate flesh from the outside in. Where fire and steel announced themselves with screams, caustics whispered and destroyed. When hands wanted quick results without the mess of surgery, they sometimes turned to chemistry. Corrosive substances, quicklime, caustic salts, acids or alkalis crudely obtained, were applied to the genital area to burn, blister, and dissolve tissue. This was not the art of a surgeon, it was the work of improvisation, of punishment in places where blades were scarce or where cruelty demanded a method that lingered. Imagine a prisoner stripped and bound while someone pours or rubs a powder or liquid over the scrotum. The sensation at first is a terrible sting, then a spreading numbness as skin breaks down and the fine layers of tissue begin to separate. Unlike an incision that removes an organ outright, chemical destruction corrupts tissue unevenly, some parts blacken and slough away, others inflame and blister, and infection finds countless places to take hold. In many accounts, corrosive methods were used when authorities wanted the spectacle of suffering kept private, or when they wished mutilation without a visible surgical wound that might attract immediate pity or public intervention. Practically, caustics had advantages for abusers. They required no surgical skill, no ligature, no heated iron, only access to substances that often existed in every pre-modern household or workshop. Quicklime, used historically for clearing refuse and whitening plaster, was a common offender in records of punitive violence because it reacts painfully with soft tissue. Other corrosives, described in various chronicles as acids or burning salts, were used when the aim was to destroy function and dignity quickly without the fanfare of an executioner's block. Medically, the consequences were savage and insidious. Chemical burns destroy not just surface skin but the deeper vascular and nerve networks that enable healing. The immediate aftermath could include massive pain, blistering, and the rapid loss of tissue. Infections set in where the skin barrier failed, septicemia, blood poisoning, could follow within days. Even survivors faced a lifetime of complications: permanently disfigured genital tissue, chronic infection or abscesses, urethral damage that made urination dangerous or impossible without crude tubes, and hormonal collapse that reshaped the body. Because the damage was often patchy and contaminated, attempts at surgical repair in historical contexts were perilous and rarely successful. Culturally, corrosives appear in the record where cruelty needed to be private, improvised, or particularly degrading. Prison punishments where knives were unavailable, hasty reprisals by raiders, or punishments meant to leave a man alive but ruined. Unlike the spectacle of public burning or the formality of palace surgery, chemical mutilation was an intimate cruelty, the kind inflicted in backrooms, in cellars, in the quiet hands of those who wished to destroy without witnesses. Chemicals turned flesh into evidence of intent, silent, corrosive testimony to cruelty that left survivors haunted long after the acids had dried. Subscribe now to Tale of History. We bring the past's shadowy methods into the light, calmly, precisely, and without flinching. Join us, and never stop asking what history tried to hide. Not every castration came from ritual chambers or execution grounds. Some were born in the chaos of violence, blows struck without precision, wounds carved by chance. On the battlefield and in the streets, blunt force could shatter manhood as surely as any surgeon's knife. Blunt trauma was the most chaotic form of emasculation. There was no brazier, no clamp, no carefully forged blade. Instead, the destruction came in the form of a kick, a stone, the butt of a spear, or the fall of a horse's hoof. In sieges, when prisoners were beaten into submission, a single misplaced strike could rupture flesh, sever vessels, and leave a man bleeding into the dirt. Ancient chronicles and medical treatises alike contain references to men injured in combat who awoke not only with broken bones and torn skin but with their reproductive organs permanently ruined. In Roman campaigns, in Mongol raids, in medieval peasant uprisings, blunt trauma was an unplanned mutilation that often carried the same consequences as deliberate castration. The mechanics were brutal in their simplicity. A crushing blow to the groin could rupture testicles, sever their internal cords, and cause massive swelling and internal bleeding. A strike hard enough could even tear the tissues away entirely, leaving an open wound not unlike surgical amputation but without the benefit of cautery or ligature. For some, the injury was accidental; for others, it was weaponized, an executioner's boot stamping down, or a mob intent on humiliation choosing the most vulnerable target. The aftermath was rarely survivable. Victims often bled internally or externally until shock overwhelmed them. Those who lived long enough to be carried away faced high risk of infection. Without controlled removal of tissue, jagged wounds became breeding grounds for rot. In some rare cases, men survived, but their lives were forever changed, rendered infertile, voices altered, and bodies weakened by the absence of vital hormones. Unlike the careful brutality of palace castrations, blunt trauma was unpredictable. Sometimes it killed instantly, other times it left a victim alive but permanently maimed. In medieval chronicles, soldiers would sometimes mock their enemies by displaying severed genitals taken not by a surgeon's hand, but by the sheer violence of battle. Even when unplanned, the result served the same symbolic function: to unman, to degrade, to render a person powerless in the eyes of their peers. What set this method apart was its rawness. No ritual, no formal process, only the uncontrolled chaos of violence. In its own way, that made it more terrifying. A man could walk into battle whole and emerge mutilated not by design but by accident, a victim not of judgment but of chance. Blunt trauma showed how easily violence could erase the line between soldier and eunuch, between combatant and casualty. In war, the body itself became collateral, reshaped by blows never meant to be clean. Subscribe now to Tale of History. Because the past is filled with horrors both deliberate and accidental, and we reveal the shadows that shaped human lives. Not every cut was chaos. Sometimes the knife was steadier, deliberate, practiced, almost clinical. In skilled hands, castration could be an operation rather than an execution, a surgeon's incision in place of an executioner's swing. The difference did not make it merciful. It only made survival possible. Surgical orchiectomy belonged to the world of practitioners, barber surgeons, physicians trained in anatomy, and later, dedicated surgeons who learned to control blood and fight infection. Where crude amputations tore and left bedlam behind, the early medical approach aimed for order, a precise incision, careful ligation of vessels, and attempts at closure that would let the body begin to mend. In a dimly lit room, the instruments were arranged like tools of a craftsman, knives honed for a clean edge, forceps to hold tissue steady, silk or linen ligatures to tie off bleeding cords, and, when available, heated metal for cautery. The patient might be bound, but here the operator moved with practiced speed and economy. A well-placed cut removed the testes, sutures or heated irons were used to control hemorrhage. Surgeons who understood the body could limit trauma to surrounding tissues and reduce the immediate risk of death. The technical improvements mattered. Clean incisions produced less ragged tissue and fewer places for bacteria to lodge. Ligatures limited the arterial spray that had felled so many in more violent settings. Some traditions included rudimentary antiseptic measures, wine or vinegar used to clean wounds, though true antisepsis waited for later centuries. Even so, these practices marked a step toward survivability. A carefully performed orchiectomy gave the body a chance to heal rather than immediately surrender to shock or infection. Medical records and surgical manuals from antiquity through the medieval period show a continuity of technique and incremental refinement. Surgeons debated where exactly to place an incision, how best to secure the spermatic cord, and which materials made the strongest ligature. In some cases, early practitioners developed instruments that minimized tissue tearing. In others, they improvised with what worked: bronze forceps, silk thread, and heated metal for hemostasis. The consequences for the patient were stark but sometimes survivable. Compared to crude methods, surgical orchiectomy lowered immediate mortality, fewer bled out in the surgeon's presence, and some patients recovered to live long lives altered but alive. Yet the risks remained: postoperative fever, abscess, urethral complications, and the slow specter of sepsis. Recovery could be prolonged and painful. The body's hormonal shift would reshape voice, musculature, and mood over months and years. Skilled hands could spare a life but never erase the cost. The surgeon's knife civilized the act only insofar as it offered survival. The wound and its consequences remained terrible and lasting. Subscribe now to Tale of History. We explore the cold precision and the human price behind history's most brutal procedures. Join us each week as we lift the lid on the past's darkest crafts. Some of history's most shocking mutilations were not imposed from above, they began with a decision. A man in a trance, a vow whispered at an altar, a promise to a god, hands that once begged for mercy now reached for the blade themselves. Self-castration is a violence turned inward, a ritual of removal chosen rather than enforced. Across eras and regions, there are haunting accounts of men who volunteered to unmake themselves. The motives were as varied as the cultures: extreme religious devotion, a desire to escape sexual temptation, the wish to evade conscription or debt, a search for identity, or psychological despair so deep that the body became the only language left. In some temple courtyards, ecstatic crowds watched as devotees offered up their manhood as a literal sacrifice. In other cases, the act was private, a desperate attempt to take control when every other choice had failed. These acts were rarely ceremonial in the sanitized sense, they were raw and dangerous. Contemporary observers often recorded the scene with equal parts fascination and horror. Men who had once been farmers, traders, or soldiers suddenly transformed in an instant into something else. The cult of Cybele in the ancient Mediterranean produced the famous Galli, priests who, in some accounts, castrated themselves in devotion. Medieval and early modern chronicles mention isolated devotees in the Near East, South Asia, and parts of Europe who followed similar paths. Some acts were impulsive, others followed long periods of fasting, trance, or communal pressure. Whatever the impulse, the outcome was brutally consistent. Self-inflicted mutilation carried enormous risk. Without surgical skill, without antiseptics, and often without anyone to intervene, many who attempted self-castration died from blood loss or fatal infection. Those who survived faced immediate medical crises and lifelong consequences: chronic infection, urinary complications, scarring and disfigurement, hormonal collapse, and the profound physiological changes that follow. The psychological aftermath could be equally severe: regret, social ostracism, and a lifetime marked by the memory of the moment that could never be undone. Culturally, the phenomenon occupied a strange place. In some religious contexts, voluntary unmaking could confer status. The survivor became a liminal figure, a priest, a seer, or a living symbol of devotion. In other settings, the act branded a person as damaged, pitiable, or mad. Many who took the blade later wished to be readmitted to ordinary life, only to find doors closed, families alienated, and communities uncertain how to treat a body and mind remade by violence. Importantly for us as historians, and for you as a viewer, these stories are not just sensational anecdotes. They reveal how deeply belief and despair can drive human choices, how religious fervor and social pressure can turn the body into theater, and how the same act can be hailed as sanctity in one place and pathology in another. They also underline the unvarnished reality: whether imposed or chosen, castration has always been medically perilous and emotionally catastrophic for many. Voluntary mutilation turned devotion into disaster and devotion's promise into a lifelong sentence. These are the intimate, terrible corners of history we rarely see in textbooks. Subscribe now to Tale of History. We pull aside the curtain on the past's most disturbing choices and the lives they destroyed. Join us, if you dare. Imagine this: your wound is festering, the flesh turning black, and the healer stands by, watching, doing nothing. Not out of ignorance, but by choice. In a time when cutting deeper meant certain death, some healers turned to a horrifying solution: let the body rot, and hope what's left can be saved. In battlefield tents and plague-ridden villages, where no surgeons could be found and no tools were clean, one nightmarish method was sometimes all they had: induced infection. Wounds were left open, sometimes even deliberately contaminated. The goal? Let infection destroy the bad tissue. Let the pus boil. Let the flesh die, so that what remained might be carved away later. It was a gamble played with fire. Sepsis was common. Limbs blackened. Skin peeled. Patients drifted between fevered screams and unconscious silence. The smell of rotting flesh lingered in infirmaries like a death sentence. But for some, it was the only hope. Better to risk a slow death than an instant one under an untrained knife. Healers bore the weight of choosing when to act, or not act at all. Families watched as loved ones decayed before their eyes, praying the rot stopped just short of the heart. These aren't just medical curiosities. They're reminders of how far we've come, and how brutal healing once was. Before anesthesia, before antiseptics, before knowledge, medicine was often a choice between death now or death later. These accounts are valuable not because they celebrate a technique, but because they illuminate the limits of past medicine and the ethical dilemmas of care under scarcity. They remind us why antisepsis, surgical training, and institutional safeguards became priorities, to replace desperate gambles with informed, humane treatment. History holds many hard lessons, none clearer than the price paid when medicine lacked the tools to heal. Understanding those choices helps us appreciate the systems that now protect patients from such desperate measures. Subscribe to Tale of History. Every episode we explore a grim corner of the past and the medical advances that closed it. Join us for more. From knives that cut in seconds to ropes that strangled flesh over days, from fire and acid to the madness of self-inflicted wounds, castration in history was more than mutilation. It was a weapon, a ritual, a punishment, and a warning. The scars it left were not only on bodies but on entire civilizations, echoing through law, religion, and memory. When we look back, it is easy to think of history as distant, names carved in stone, empires long fallen. But methods like these remind us that the past still breathes in the darkest corners of human imagination. They show us how far people have gone, and how fragile the line is between order and cruelty. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: history does not bury its nightmares. It leaves them waiting, hidden in chronicles and scars, until someone dares to open the door. If you want to keep walking those shadowed halls, if you want to face the forgotten cruelties, the rituals, and the punishments that shaped our world, then join us. Subscribe now to Tale of History. Because the past is darker than you think, and here, we tell the stories most would rather forget.